Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's District Administration Web Seminar, Building the Business Case, How Districts Can Save Money, Stay Flexible, and Innovate During Times of Uncertainty. Brought to you by the generous support of Amazon Web Services. Before we get underway, a couple of quick housekeeping items. For technical support, use the chat panel at the right of your screen and select my name, Jason York, and type your message if you're having any kind of technical issue. Can't hear or prefer to listen privately? There will be a phone number posted in just a minute with an access code that will allow you to listen to the presentation through your phone. To submit a question to our panel, please use the Q&A at the bottom right of the screen and select your question to all panelists. Don't see a panel? Click the expand panel triangle in front of any panel. And need access to the presentation at a later time? Everyone will receive an email with links to both the slides and the archive recording. And with that, we're going to get our presentation underway today. I'm going to turn it over now to Lenny Shad.
Well, good afternoon or good morning to everyone, depending on where you are in the country. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and looking forward to a great conversation. We'll do a quick round of introductions before we get into the meat of the presentation. So quickly about me, I am a former CIO, been in the education space since 2003. Was in Katy ISD for about 10 years, and then I was the CIO for Houston ISD up until 2019, and went to work at that point with district administration, and I have the pleasure of working with superintendents, technology leaders, academic officers, helping them to understand the role technology can play in overall district planning. So it's a great job, have a lot of fun with it. I've had a long-standing relationship with one of our panelists, Keith Kruger. I was a former board member for COSN, and I know Keith is going to have some great insight. And Mark is a sitting CIO that's actually deep in the middle of all the chaos that's ensuing right now. So I'm sure Mark is going to give us some great insight as well. So that's a little bit about me. Keith, why don't you give us a little introduction about yourself?
I have to unmute myself. Thanks, Lenny. It's great to be here with you and with Mark. As you just said, you're one of my former bosses as a board member of COSN. COSN's a national association for people who are heads of technology like Mark. It's been around not quite 30 years, and almost all of that time I've had the honor of being their chief executive officer. And so while I'm certainly not an expert on the topic of cloud computing or other technical topics, I certainly have heard a lot of what kind of technology leaders are thinking about and why they are migrating to the cloud. So hope that's helpful.
Perfect, Keith. Look forward to hearing from you. All right, Mark, you're the one that's in the trenches, so we're anxious to hear from you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, Lenny. Thank you, everybody. So I'm Mark Finstrom, a Chief Technology Officer. I'm also a CETL, which is a COSN certificate, so Certified Education Technology Leader. I work for a school district out in Seattle that's around SeaTac International Airport. Highland Public Schools. Dr. Susan Enfield is my superintendent. I'm proud to serve with her and the rest of my cabinet and for the school district. And been out here for 15 years and been in 3 states serving in the same capacity, both as a district and a education service district level.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Mark. Good to have you on board here. So our agenda today, we're gonna start with 4 high-level questions, and I'm sure within each question we're gonna go down a bunch of different rabbit holes that will be interesting conversations. So before we get into the first one, and the question is, why are districts making the move to the cloud? Keith, why don't you tell us from your perspective of having breadth and depth of reach to a number of school systems around the country, what are you hearing from them as to why they're actually moving to the cloud?
Yeah, well, and I think this has been a trend of a number of years, and that's not to say that school districts have moved everything to the cloud. Clearly, you know, applications, software as a service, the way we get email and the content of the things that school districts do has largely moved to the cloud. And now I think we're thinking of cloud as an infrastructure. And there's been lots of discussion within our community. Again, we're vendor neutral and agnostic about how exactly to do it, but we want to make sure that those leaders like Mark and like you were, Lenny, when you were at Houston, and Katie, ISDs, really have the right questions to ask, and really a vision around what evolving into the cloud is. And I think, Lenny, you particularly have an interesting background, having come from districts that often were very impacted by hurricanes or flooding. And so I think a lot of the early work around this was we saw after, Hurricane Katrina a decade ago, that lots of school districts lost their entire network. And so disaster preparedness was some of the early reasons why districts were moving. But I think there's many more, and I'm sure we'll dive into, around cost, around efficiency, scalability, allowing you access to data, things like that.
Thanks, Keith. It's interesting as I look back on my careers in Katy and in Houston, both districts were early adopters of this concept of mobile learning, remote learning. In Katy, we were one of the first districts to actually start giving mobile devices for kids to take home. And, as you start to look at this concept of anytime, anywhere, that's for me when I started to really get introduced and have an interest in the cloud. And you're right, with crisis management, it's all about being agile and flexible and getting things done very quickly. As you fast forward to what we just went through in March and April, it was the epitome of a nationwide, disaster. That I think that the unique thing about what we're going through is hurricanes are a point in time, and you always knew in the back of your mind you were going to rubber band back to the way you always did things. And I don't think that this is going to be a rubber band back. And so, Mark, as you start to think through, what your introductions, your drivers were to the cloud, and then particularly what the COVID situation did for you, talk to us about the cloud and what you see happening there.
Well, COVID was basically you talk about a rubber band. We were shot by a rubber band. We were basically catapulted ahead and had to make decisions quickly, rapidly, and within days to get our students and our teachers online. So the biggest things that we had were, our student information system was in the cloud already, but what about all the LMS tools that we're using? Think about the security of our data, data privacy, the efficiency of getting people to log in and work on things. I mean, it is clear that while we were prepping to move to the cloud, we were not at the cloud and not there at the time that we needed to be. And all of our planning that has been happening since March is getting us to the point where we may be fully effective when it comes to September of the new year. We'll have more tools that are available online. We'll have more single sign-on access. Devices will be prepared and can connect wherever they are and be able to either VPN into very specific tools or be in the free internet access mode. But resiliency of the team and resiliency of the service, that was really what we had to overcome, and we had to get to that point of moving to the cloud is a wise decision.
So, Mark, for the benefit of our attendees, why don't you tell us a little bit about Highland Public? Tell us some demographics around it.
Sure. So one of the biggest things, and it's on this page, is our promise. Know every student by name, strength, and need, and prepare them for the future that they choose. We believe that our population deserves everything that we can provide for them, and so it's important that we are working on that. So we have 33 schools across a K-12 environment, a little over 19,000 students, a little over 100 languages that are spoken. We have our fair share of McKinney-Vento students, which are the homeless. We have our fair share of ELL students, newcomers who come in, and our special needs students. But really, I think the biggest thing to know about our population is we're 5 distinct communities that work together as one. We surround SeaTac International Airport. There's a lot of community engagement and involvement, and we as a leadership team are very well-oiled and working together across all of our areas to make sure that we're making the best decisions for our community as we go forward.
And that's such a key when you come into situations like a COVID. It's when teams come together and strategize together, plan together. That's when they're most effective. Keith, I want to go back to this slide and just look at some of the things as you think about what districts have gone through in the last 3 months, and in the conversations you've had with them. What do you think are some of the highlights when you look at the red items on here? What have been some of the biggest drivers or benefits in conversations you've had with them?
Yeah, and I think, what you said a few minutes ago, in Washington, we have a saying, never let a crisis go to waste to do something good. And this is definitely a moment of crisis. And you're right that we used to call it IT crisis preparedness and talked about natural disaster. But with remote learning, suddenly, overnight, with a day or two warning, maybe if you were lucky, you had a couple of days, every student, every teacher was working remotely. So that, I look at that issue of like agility down at the far end, the ability to kind of instantly scale your network is really, really critical. And, also you see on that equity. Making sure that every student and teacher has access to resources, which, if you have to be on-prem, it's not. And so being in the cloud gives you that much flexibility. There's all these other things that I think are very handy for school districts, like having the data and analytics so that they can see what's actually being used. And that, a lot of things that the central office purchases may or may not be used. And so you can actually see actual usage and only pay for the usage that you're needed. Now those are all the benefits there, of course. It's a real different way of thinking about how you finance this. It really, shifts this, from a CapEx, a capital budget, to an operational budget. So I'm not saying that everyone is doing this overnight. It involves really working with your finance office and your superintendent and school board to make sure they see why we're doing this. But, I think if ever there was a moment where you can see the benefits of cloud enabling remote learning, it's been in the last few months.
How about for you, Mark? What are the highlights of this out of the red text that jumped out for you when you think about the last 2 months and what you've done with the cloud?
Oh, it's agility and equity for sure. The ability to just turn a switch basically, and you can move multiple devices into a new world. The equity, everybody having access to the same information. That is, if they have access to the internet, that's another issue that we have to deal with. But, I keep challenging my team to experiment as well. Try and find ways to meet the needs of all of our students and be device agnostic. I really don't care what device that they're using. I want them to be able to have access to the same information on a phone as well as a laptop or a desktop, or doesn't matter what OS. So, the cloud gives us that opportunity. It gives us the ability to be experimenters, innovators. It allows us to be agile and change things. And if we don't like how it works, you know what? We just spin it down and spin it back up again. So in many ways, the cloud has become that sandbox that districts had a hard time funding and having on site, because how do you build an environment for all of the different variables. Well, now you can build as many different environments as you want.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, and if you look at just this week, around the country, you're having school systems who are making this decision to say, we're starting 100% remote. You know, Houston ISD, Broward, Miami, there's a lot of big systems. And I think that is going to be a trend that we see only picking up momentum. But if you think about what the planning was up until this week, it was some type of hybrid model, right, where you were going to have some kids who were on site, some kids who were face-to-face. When we talk about agility, that is the agility that this cloud provides, is that in a matter of a week, you can quickly pivot to say we went from a portion of kids remote to now our entire student population remote, and in a matter of, you know, hours, flip that switch and be ready for that. So agility really jumps out to me, and I think this past week is a great example. The equity side, I think, is such an important conversation because up until about 3 weeks ago, the equity conversation was all about devices and internet, right? But the critical part about this isn't the device. The device isn't the magic. It's what they're going to connect to and use. Mm-hmm. And I think that now districts are past that panic of do we have device, do we have internet, and now really focusing on what is the content. So I really appreciate both of you highlighting that, you know, equity just isn't about a device. It's about what the resources are the kids are going to have access to. All right, let's move on to number 2, shifting the mindset from spring to fall. We've talked about this a little bit. You know, we were in firefighter mode in the spring, March and April and May, and as technology people, firefighter mode is a spot we never like to be in, right? And as we start to think about moving into that proactive mode, Mark, or let's start with you, Keith. What are you seeing districts doing differently in preparation for start of school than when they reacted in March and April?
Well, I think there was no question, and some of the issues remain, like the equity of broadband access at home, like the devices. But you know, that was called remote learning, and hopefully it was a needed emergency situation. And unfortunately, you know, I think we're seeing some of the labeling that was a big failure. I think we have to keep in mind that was the choice between no learning or what the best we could patch together. But I think the expectations for the fall by parents and the community and policymakers is higher. And I think you're absolutely right, Lenny, that in the last week, you know, most school districts around the country were planning for 3 scenarios, you know, fully at school, blended, and fully remote. And I think increasingly we're going to see school districts, many school districts have announced this last week that they're going to stay fully virtual, at least through the fall. And those narrow, that's not to say that every school district will. And I think the biggest mindset is the shift of parents and the public, in that I think parents know how tough it is to do teaching and learning. They also see that it hasn't always been executed in great ways. And I think they're nervous because if they're expected to be back at work, how do they make virtual work?
Yeah. You know, I mean, and I think, again, if there ever was a time when business community and the education community need to come together, this is it, right? Because the school district making a decision to go to remote when the business community is expecting face-to-face, that provides a real dilemma for a lot of people, and jobs are at risk, right? So this is a community issue. The other thing that I want to talk about is, you know, you're right, Keith, and there's been a lot of bad press about what the experience was in March and April. And, you know, having been in this kind of an environment where we implemented remote learning, it's at best a 2 to 3 year initiative, right? And overnight, March and April, every district, whether they were ready to or not, had to embrace this. So I think we have to be realistic in what the reality of is what we can get accomplished. And in March, parents were very accepting of what we're going to do. Mark, when you think about your parents and the reaction to how quickly you pivoted, and some things you did well, some things you didn't do well, how are you managing the expectations of your parents for this start of school to help them understand we're not going to have everything perfect, but we're going to be better than we were in March?
Well, a lot of that comes down to communication, so we spend a lot more time now talking with our families. We're getting feedback all the time. We used to talk about death by survey. Honestly, we're probably in the real death by survey right now because we are sending surveys and talking with people continually. But we came up with a group, 5 groups came out of our cabinet. We have investing in our people, which is really about making sure that we have the right people doing the right tasks. We have the whole child, which is talking about SEL, the education, the home life, the communication, that fine line between student at home, student at school, and what's appropriate in terms of communication and when to work with students. There's the distance learning where we're talking about, as you said, the hybrid. We're spinning up a virtual school and a virtual academy right now. And, it's all the different components that go with that. And then there's the academics, which is talking about how do you make sure that you get every child trained appropriately. And then the operations side, which is coming in and not just having a facility if they return to school, but having a clean facility and having food for the kids, etc. So our 5 teams are managed by members of us inside cabinet, and we work together. But basically, our whole premise is to make sure that the family understands what we're here to do for them, for the student, make sure that our students are successful. Remember, go back to our promise, know every student by name, strength, and need, and prepare them for the future that they choose. It is imperative, it's paramount that we focus on that in everything that we do.
Mark, if you reflect back on the spring, what were some of the lessons learned from the spring that you've been able to implement better solutions for as you start out this new school year? Maybe give us 1 or 2 things that you had to react quickly in the spring, but now as you approach the start of school, you're implementing a more thoughtful, maybe even a better, more long-term solution.
Part of it is while we have an adoption process for tools used in the classroom, too many tools made it into the environment. So we've narrowed down the platforms that we're using for our instruction. That is going to be a huge component of this because it will allow teachers to focus on one thing and parents not to have to know, well, do I go here? Do I go there? What login do I use? What's the next thing? So that's probably the biggest one. The other one is, everybody talks about single sign-on and having single sign-on as the gateway. I will tell you, you try, and you get it to work for some things. And I think the process that we're going through right now is really the key for getting that, selecting the right tool and working on that tool solely so that we can make sure that when the students return in the fall, they can log on using a QR code, they can log on using their regular login, and honestly, they now have access to every tool without having to have to know, well, where do I go to get to that tool?
And Lenny, one of the things that we haven't talked about is the shifting mindset of teachers. And Ed Week did a survey of teachers self-assessing their tech skills. And since March, it was something like 46% of teachers said they've significantly improved their technology skills. Another 42% said slightly. Well, that's kind of seismic in terms of, for those of us, who have been working at this for, the last decade or 2 decades or beyond, that's a fundamental pivot for where teachers are seeing themselves.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point, Keith. Thank you. Mark, going back to your earlier point, more isn't always better, right? And so, the tools that are out there, I think it's a really important thing, and kudos to you and your district for really streamlining those. All right, we're going to move on to the next question, building a resilient district. And so, Mark, what benefits have you seen? What kind of cost savings have you seen as you've migrated to this resilient district that's leveraging the cloud?
Well, we go back to that agility at the beginning where we were talking about speed. We can throw something up without expending a lot of district resources, try it out, experiment it with a few key teachers or maybe even just within IT to make sure it's going to work without spending thousands and thousands of dollars on something. So, that's one huge savings. The other one is often we're trying to build solutions that we can use with staff for, analytics related to every child. The ability to see how successful that child is with every aspect of their education, whether or not it's their math or science or social studies, etc. To be able to look at the tools that are used, the assessments that are given, and all the other components that the teacher puts in with those students, and see them on a dashboard that is readable, understandable, and transferable to the day-to-day work that's happening in the classroom and at real time. So, we're going through a total redesign of a lot of our data systems and dropping that data up online in a place where a teacher can actually see real time how their student is progressing through the curriculum. And I think that's going to be a huge time saver, as well as you think about curriculum saver, because the teacher will know, I taught the concept that gained it, versus I don't know if they really understood it. I don't have a place where I can go to get that information. And then the last thing is really, cloud provides so much better in terms of devices and infrastructure. I cannot compete with a AWS. Amazon Web Services is thousands and thousands of servers across the world, and I can have my data stored in other places because I'm sitting on top of a fault line here in Washington. At any point in time, there could be another Nisqually earthquake up here, and I could lose half of my services, but I could still continue instruction because I have services offsite.
Perfect. Yeah, great point. Both of you talked earlier about having this need for an understanding of just the nuances around cloud, this switch from CapEx to OpEx. Mark, as you started to have these conversations with your finance team and others, what were some of the strategies that you used to help build the business case for these people, and just how they're going to allocate money differently? Because that is a real barrier for some districts to adopt this.
Oh, it's definitely a huge barrier. Often the thing is, an application gets selected and then IT finds out about it. So it's being at the table and being aware, communicating with all the stakeholders, having processes in place that prevent something from happening that you're not aware of, because you might be able to adjust that and be more successful. But, our CFO, she's a strong individual who understands the market. She understands that there are solutions that are better off outside of this organization, or that are better off in the cloud, because they can provide a ramp up, the ability to move quickly for the needs. Our superintendent talks to me quite a bit about, Mark, you need to be able to make sure that services can be provided to all at basically breakneck speed, and I understand that. And I can't necessarily do that with my tools. So what I need to do is I need to leverage not the legacy systems, but I need to leverage the cloud systems, which have the ability to move quickly. I can adjust something in a test environment. I can make it a real-time environment in a matter of minutes. And I can be cutting down on my costs of some of my staffing, because my staffing can then get reallocated into higher order thinking skill staff. So no longer are they supporting the legacy systems, they're now supporting cloud-based systems. They become more effective, and they begin to understand the needs of the classroom a little bit more. And the other thing with it is really the whole methodology has just changed. The methodology of you own it, you provide it, you build it, you support it. It's no longer like that. In many cases, the support is no longer part of our organization. Our student information system, we want support. Most of that support doesn't come from the IT department. It comes from people who support the application, because that's really what it's about. And then they shift it up the line for things that are related to the students.
Great, thanks. Keith, as you think about the districts around the country and their transition to the cloud, what are 2 or 3 things that you would say are critical factors districts need to consider as they're building their business case to take up to their approvals?
I think the first one is you have to think about what's your core competency. And a decade ago, we saw lots of districts building large data centers, especially bigger districts. But I think Mark has already pointed out, even in in sophisticated districts, it may not be your core competency to run a data center. And so I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it ever, but I think you have to figure out, what are the costs of that, and how quickly can you react to changing circumstances? And, there's a lot of advantage to having that flexibility and really paying for what you need. I think a lot of conversation around this cloud decision is both cost, because it isn't perhaps as predictable because you're doing it on usage, and then on security. And so, I think those are driving conversations that, and I think also Mark pointed out that, sometimes the people on the technology team get worried they're going to lose their job if you go into the cloud. So helping them understand that there are other things that are maybe even higher value that they can help with than sort of running the data network.
Yeah, and I want to dig a little bit deeper on this staffing thing, because I think it's really important, and it was something that I faced in both of the districts that I was in. There was this fear that the cloud somehow is going to replace and take my job. And I think it's important for the districts out there to understand staffing is always an issue no matter what district you're in. And the ability to add staff on an annual basis is, you have to be very selective. And so rather than the conversations I had with my teams, rather than thinking of it as taking my job, it's giving you the ability to take away the work that you complained about having to do, that mundane work. And all of those operation guys and people like that, they all do that, right? And there's just mundane work that the cloud takes off their plate, and it repurposes their skill sets to the more technical skills that they enjoy doing. And I think if you sit down and have those kind of conversations with your team, the fear factor around cloud really diminishes, because it allows them to do the things that are really what they want to do. So let's talk about strategic planning, because as we all talked about earlier, March and April, we were in a firefight mode. And we've all jumped into the deep end of an initiative that takes 2 to 3 years at best. What I'm seeing with the districts that I'm working with and talking with is strategic planning really has taken on a whole new life cycle. We used to think in terms of 3 to 5 years. And because we were thrown into the deep end so quickly, I'm seeing a lot of districts embracing this concept of strategic sprints. So our first sprint is the start of school. And we want to be able to say, here's where we're better than we were in March. And our next sprint might be 3 months down the road after the start of school, and then another 3 months, and another 3 months. So I'm seeing this mindset shift from years, 3 years, 5 years strategic planning to these strategic sprints. Keith, are you seeing that same kind of change in strategic planning?
I think I really like the way you framed that, and I think the way I would describe it, which I think is complementary, is districts are very used to thinking about crisis preparedness planning. What we definitely saw the last few months is the need to plan for learning continuity, which includes crises like fires, floods, hurricanes, but it's much bigger than that. And with the pandemic, we've seen, you have to be able to have, we're probably going to see waves of kids going back to school and then coming back home. And so you really need that continuity of learning kind of built right in. But I agree with everything you've said too.
Well, and Mark, I'm going to feed off a little bit about what you were talking with your 5 strategic groups. Managing the expectations of what your parents are going to assume, I think, is so critical because, again, we only had 3 or 4 months to improve from what happened in March and April. So if we allow our other people to define what their expectations are for us, we're never going to be able to meet those. And so if we really start talking in terms of here's where we're going to be better than we were in these sprints, it allows district leaders to really manage the expectations that they're going to set forth to their community. And it sounds like, Mark, you guys have kind of embraced that attitude of, these short-term cycles. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, I mean, we're not there, but we are embracing the concept that we need to be in those sprints. I'm right now in the process of purchasing a bunch more devices because I know that I have a sprint coming up here shortly, and if I don't get these devices, I'm not going to be able to meet the need. But I like the idea of this conversation about our staffing, and I want to go down 2 paths. You have your instructional staff, and you have your technical staff. Everybody who's really probably listening here is thinking about the technical side. I want to hit the instructional side for a minute. Our staff on the instructional side have to be just as nimble as the staff on the technical side in terms of their skill sets and their ability to move, especially in their teaching role. One, they may not have the skill set for the different types of tech that are used. So there's PD and other things that have to go along with that. I'm spinning up this virtual academy, and I have to staff it with my staff, and I have to be able to provide that level of, shall we say, accountability for the parents that it's going to be a full-time school, and parents are going to be able to communicate with the teacher. Students are going to be able to communicate with the teacher and with their peers. And there's a huge amount of, I would even say it's a bell curve of skill set on the instructional side. And we need to make sure that we speed up that deployment process with them as well. Because I can speed up my process, but if the instructional side is not following in line with me, so I talked about investing in our people. If we are not investing in our people and building that academic model that's going right with them, what's going to happen is we're going to fall flat. And we need to make sure that we model all that information well so that we can replicate it and move forward.
I love that because it circles us back around to the conversation that we started out with, which was in this time, we have to have our leadership teams coming together, planning together, strategizing together so that it doesn't matter if technology is throwing out these solutions. If the curriculum team, the professional development team don't understand how to leverage it, it's all for naught. So thank you for kind of wrapping that bow around it and bringing us back to and that through line. All right, the last thing that I think is really important is Keith, we've been talking for years on COSN how technology has to have a seat at the table. And we believe that, the technology leaders should be reporting to the cabinet because it's that critical. And it's one of these scenarios where be careful what you ask for, because now all of a sudden technology has a seat at the table, right? And so when in your conversations with your membership out there, what are you seeing as maybe the top 3 skill sets that technology leaders that were thrust into this new seat where they're really struggling and need some help and can leverage an organization like COSIN to help them get there?
If I think we finally have a seat at the table, it may be an ejection seat if things don't go well.
Exactly.
Well, I think, you can't just have the technical expertise around issues like cloud. You have to really understand the instructional value of the technology. What is it doing for teaching and learning? And then I think the other component, the other bucket, the third bucket, is kind of having that leadership and vision. And so Mark mentioned that he's a CETL, a Certified Education Technology Leader. Everything we kind of do ties to a framework, which is a body of knowledge. And it certainly includes understanding the technology, but if that's all you have and don't understand the education and don't really understand the leadership or have the language around that, you can't really be at a cabinet level.
Keith, you've heard me say this for years. Technology, I believe, is actually the easiest part of the equation of where we sit. It's the leadership, it's organizational change management, it's expectation management, it's vision, it's all of those kind of things. So Keith, why don't you tell us a little bit about COSIN Send initiative?
Sure.
and what you've got going on there?
Yeah, this is a kind of a vendor neutral resource. So we appreciate that AWS is one of the sponsors of it, but we have multiple sponsors. In fact, most of the major cloud providers are all helping us make sure that what we're providing is good advice for you, kind of regardless of the specific strategy or solution provider you provide. And you can see a picture there of one of the infographics. We heard about the importance of talking to your superintendent or your cabinet or your school board. This is something you can download off the COSIN website. We have a superintendent's initiative, and this is part of that, kind of helping them understand why they should even care about something called the cloud. We also have a lot of other tools that are up there, including kind of why cloud and we asked all of those AWS and other providers kind of how do you save money, and we've got a case study. So there's quite a bit of resources. Just poke around again at cosin.org/cloud. Lenny, I don't think I can hear you.
Thank you. I hate when I mute myself, especially when I've got something brilliant to say, like I just said. So
you'll have to say it again.
So, I know it. So what I was saying is the important thing for everybody that's attending is that this is a wheel that doesn't need to be invented by you. The wheel has been invented, and there are a lot of districts like Mark who have been in the trenches. And I encourage everybody out there to reach out and talk to people who have been in the cloud. They can give you their lessons learned and maybe help jumpstart you and maybe expedite you actually implementing a cloud solution. So leverage your peer network out there. This is a time we all have to come together. All right, very quickly, gentlemen, I'm going to give you about a minute to 2 minutes to give us your closing thoughts on how you build the case for cloud and how it's so applicable to the environment we're in right now. Keith, I'll start with you.
Boy, if there was ever a moment to rethink what we're doing, now is that moment. And we need quick, agile, scalable solutions. And the rest of the world outside of education has moved to the cloud. And it's time that we not get left behind, but we really ensure equitable access for every student and teacher.
Awesome. Mark, your swing at the plate.
change is inevitable. And we are in that change mode right now where you make a decision right now, and probably later today that decision's going to change again. You have to be nimble. That's really what comes to play when you're using resources like AWS or any other cloud source provider. Your student information system, they have to be nimble. You have to be able to adjust. Well, I have to be able to adjust. I have to be able to adjust to the teacher needs, the student needs, the staff needs, and I need to be able to make sure that our families are saying, we did the right thing.
Awesome. So I'm going to add my little 2 cents onto this thing. And Mark, I'm going to feed off of your comment. You're right. Change is inevitable. The unique thing that we're in is we are in an incredibly disruptive change. We have flipped the apple cart upside down for every institution in the country, K-12 institution. That in and itself has a lot of challenges. You add into that there's also this emotional side. Families are going through trauma themselves, losing their job, maybe losing a loved one. And so we have to be very cognizant that it's more than putting a plan out there and saying execute. We have to take into account the emotional state of every one of our employees and just the overall anxiety and worry. And so as leaders, I hope all of you are taking that into consideration. And as you're having that conversation with your staff members, put yourself into their place. And I guarantee you when you do that, that dialogue will change. Your messaging will change. The other thing that I'd like to add on to this is budgets are going to continue to shrink. And because as the states are suffering from this, just like everybody else, school budgets are going to shrink. And so if there was ever a time to look at ways that you can continue to provide outstanding service that is the expectation of your staff, your district, and your parents, cloud computing is a way for you to take advantage of some cost savings, be agile and nimble, just like our colleagues on the panel have said. So, gentlemen, it has been my absolute pleasure. You guys have thrown out a lot of really good nuggets for our attendees. Jason, at this time, I'm going to turn it over to you to help us dive into some questions.
Okay, thanks a lot here, Lenny. A lot of great takeaways here from everybody, from Mark and Keith on some things. So let's dive in here to the Q&A. Question here, what are some of the biggest cloud challenges that your district, so this will probably be geared toward Mark or even perhaps others, what are some of the biggest cloud challenges your district is trying to overcome?
Most of it is integration with other systems and moving data back and forth between. There are systems. Lenny, you know this. We talked about common cartridge. We talked about LMSs. We talked about integration across systems. You can't do it unless you come up with a common dictionary of information, and then you use that common dictionary with all your tools. Lenny, your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, I think you touched on something that the districts that I'm working closely with, the challenge now is if you think about students in a remote setting, how do you measure growth? How do you measure what they're doing on a daily basis? And so it's not necessarily a challenge with the cloud, but it's a challenge with all the data that's up in the cloud. How do I now start to leverage that in a systematic way to provide relevant information back? And so I think that's, for me, that's kind of the next challenge for the cloud, is to really help us think through quickly providing some analytics for our parents, for our teachers, and for our administrators. In general, I think the cloud, it's picking up momentum. I think this COVID-19 has brought to light the power of it. I still think that there are challenges around getting the funding aspects of that understood within the finance team. So I think we have some work to do there. COSIN has done a great job of putting some great information and help sets out there. Keith, what do you think?
And the one thing we really haven't talked about is security, which I think is the the issue that always gets raised when people talk about putting things in the cloud, because clearly things are more accessible if you can get to it on your phone, if you can get it on mobile devices. But I'm not necessarily convinced, or at least many of our members are not convinced, that cloud is less secure, and in fact maybe more secure. But there is a perception issue around security, and I think there are lots of questions to be asked of providers of, show me how this is more secure than keeping it on a server in my own district.
Yeah, you just poked the hornet's nest, Keith. Cybersecurity, right? I mean, that is a topic that we could spend an easy hour on. But you're right. You know, cybersecurity is front and center, and I think if you do the due diligence, and I'm sure Mark, you were very focused on your cloud providers that you selected. You've got to prove to me that you have that cybersecurity presence and infrastructure to protect us. And so, you know, the good news is a company like AWS, they're doing this for 1,000 organizations, private sector, public sector around the world, and they've done a very good job of that. So I think it's a topic that needs to be addressed and focused on. Jason, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, interesting question here. So how has sports and recreation departments handled the COVID-19 crisis? I know that Mark started to answer the question to one of the people that asked it in the audience, but if you can flesh that out a little bit, that's a very interesting dynamic here. You don't think about sports often when it comes to remote learning and remote access. So you want to expand on that, Mark, and then Lenny and Keith can chime in as well.
Yeah, you know, there are esports options. So we do a lot with those. There is online PE. It's not considered esports, but it's online PE. And, you know, everything changed from the perspective of being on the same field or the same court and interacting to now it's personal, and people are setting goals online, and you know, our staff are moving to this aspect of, you know, they're challenging the students to set realistic goals and attain those. You know, like they're no longer just running around on a soccer field. They actually may be jogging, and you know, some kids are losing weight. Some kids are finding that they're getting stronger. You know, they've been able to spend more time doing personal things like lifting weights, and then the activities that go along with that have a direct result on the learning, because the learning is now stimulated by the brain, because the brain is saying, hey, my body's feeling pretty good. So there are some good things coming out of this related to esports and online PE and challenges, you know, Twitter challenges, etc.
Keith, do you have any input?
Very little. If I know little about cloud computing, I know even less about esports. But I will say this is a pivot moment, and that esports are really taking off, and that in many districts that may be the only sport available at this moment in a virtual world. So you know, I would think that there will be a lot of focus and attention on it as an opportunity.
Yeah, certainly esports has grown, and it's continuing to grow. And you know, it was picking a lot of momentum up in higher ed, but within the last year, we're seeing it really expand out into the K-12 market, with a lot of districts really creating their own leagues and different things like that. As we talked, you know, this is a 2 to 3 year initiative, and there are some things we're doing really well, some things that we need a lot of time to grow. I think this is an area. I think the whole social, emotional, physical supports for students is something that everybody recognizes. We're not anywhere near the end zone yet. We have a lot of work to do on it. And so I think the encouraging thing is that there's a lot of really good organizations that are focused on solutioning this. And, you know, again, as we start to go through the next year, I think we're going to see districts who are really coming up with some inventive innovative solutions that I'm hoping other school districts don't think they have to reinvent that wheel again. But to me, this is an area where we've got to grow in, and it's that whole side of the student, social, emotional, and physical. All right, Jason, throw us another one.
All right, well, those are all the questions that we have today, and we are nearing the top of the hour here. We're 5 minutes away from the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead here and wrap up with everybody. So Lenny, Keith, Mark, a lot of great takeaways today. Thank you for your time and expertise covering building the business case for the cloud and how districts can save money, be flexible, be innovative. A lot of evergreen things here that people are going to be able to take away and take back to their school districts. So thank you again to all three of you.
Thank you.
Seminars.
Keith, it's always a pleasure talking to you. And Mark, best of luck to your start of school, my friend.
Thank you, Lenny. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you. Have a great day.
When our webinars like this today, like you heard with Lenny, Mark, and Keith, are part of our mission here at District Administration, the leader in editorial coverage of news, trends, and current issues in K-12 management. You can subscribe for free to our print magazine, our digital edition, email newsletters, and listen to web seminars like the one you heard here today. Thank you for joining us, and remember, the archive recording of the web seminar will be available to you to review or share with members of your team tomorrow at the website, and you will also receive an email with a link to the slides. So on behalf of District Administration, this is Jason York. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.